Hello, I'm your host, Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to the Work, Learning, and Social Change Foundational Voices series, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking with Kiran Mirchandani, professor of adult education at the University of Toronto in Canada. With a background in cultural studies and sociology, her work has spanned 3 decades and is known for its contributions to understandings of race, gender, as well as globalization and workplace learning. Welcome and hello. Our discussion series, as you may have come to know, is meant to be informal. But let me begin with a few prepared remarks in order to introduce the guest for this episode. Kiran Mirchandani is a professor of adult education at the University of Toronto, where her research and teaching have focused on gendered and racialized processes in the workplace, transnational service work, critical perspectives on organizational practices, migration, and learning. She is the author and co-author of a large number of influential reviews, articles, and monographs, and edited collections. These include Criminalizing Race, Criminalizing Poverty, Welfare Fraud Enforcement in Canada, 2007. One of my personal favorites, Phone Clones, Transnational Service Work in the Global Economy, 2012, and more recently, Low Wage in High Tech, an ethnography of service workers in global India, 2019. Amidst all this, there's more we could add to this, but amidst all this, she's also found time to co-edit an important collection entitled Borders in Service, Enactments of Nationhood in Transnational Call Centers. This is in 2016. She's been a highly sought after invited speaker at events around the world. She's a founding director of the Workplace Learning and Social Change program at the University of Toronto. And she has co-chaired the 12th Researching Work and Learning International Conference. I'm delighted to call her a colleague and a friend. Kiran, welcome. It's absolutely good to see you again. We see each other from time to time in meetings, obviously, as colleagues. But it's great that you take time to make a contribution to our discussion series. How are you?
Thank you, Peter. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for doing this.
Okay, great. It's a really fun exercise for me. I get to kind of hear people talk about things they don't always get a chance to in a way in our run of middle life as professors. Okay, let me jump into my very first question. I want to begin at the beginning in a way. And it's about the kind of inspirations and foundations of your work. So in the course of your evolution as a scholar, have there been people or pieces of writing or research traditions or whatever that you would consider as foundational or inspirational to your approach to work, learning, and social change?
Yeah, so, I guess, for me, really, the starting point has been always the connection between these 3 concepts, work, learning, and social change. And I realize, that I've been much less interested in definitional issues around learning. That is, debates on what is learning, and much more interested in sort of the social contexts of work, which are continually being affected and changed. And I think, that which brings about this kind of change is really learning. So I see learning as kind of our way of understanding the ways in which, through work or through effort, we strive to kind of change our societies and our communities and our lives. And I'm really sort of interested, I guess, in the ways in which systems of inequality embedded in work characterize our contemporary reality. So, that is sort of almost like the bedrock in terms of systemic features of learning environments. And, I feel like we spend so much of our time in workplaces, and these collective spaces have so much potential in some ways to be life affirming. So, I guess I see learning as having the potential to make these spaces life affirming, although it isn't always. In terms of influences, I guess, in my early education, I did degrees in cultural studies and in social and political theory. And I was very influenced by, I guess the critical race theorists and the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. These scholars drew on Marx and Gramsci to focus on how really cultures are being continually constructed and reproduced in daily lives. And, cultures were really thought about in very broad terms in terms of social norms and structures and practices. And very intertwined with the economy. So, my interest was really in how people resisted in daily life, made sort of, were sort of like continually engaged in forms of resistance to hegemonic structures. And I guess this is what really shaped how I approached and saw learning, and in this way, I always kind of conceptualized learning as a necessarily kind of political practice.
Mm-hmm.
I also, when I think back, have been very influenced by the broad body of work, which we now maybe broadly refer to as feminist political economy. This idea that there isn't really a separation between what we see as work or paid work and what we see as social reproduction. Often learning, I think, is characterized as social reproduction or not really seen as work. And I think that feminist political economists' focus on social reproduction led me to be very interested in learning as, say, emotional or aesthetic labor. That is, learning to sort of feel particular ways or to look and sound in particular ways as well. And I guess, another set of influences was a group of feminist scholars, who were writing, I guess, very early in the 80s. There was a book called All Women Are White, All Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. I don't know if you remember that collection.
Mm-hmm.
Or another one by Bell Hooks called Ain't I a Woman, very early, sort of fairly early work of hers. And I guess these became fairly foundational to the ways in which I approach these connections between work, learning, and social change, because I was always sort of interested in the view from the margins. That is, how is knowledge on particular phenomenon and learning is one such phenomena sort of prioritizes the hegemonic, the visible, the powerful. So my interest was always to look for the more marginal voices and to ask who is left out of narratives of learning and progress.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Views from the margins. I mean, not to overlay and try to resolve all the threads that you were mentioning there, but that rings true for me when I think of the work I've read of yours, that one way or another, that's like a strong beating heart of the analysis. And I understand completely your well, how do we put that? Maybe less than enthusiastic concern to wade into the definitional game of different forms of learning. Although in a kind of back-end way, isn't it the case that when you bring up, and I'm kind of, I guess, projecting ahead to maybe what we'll talk about in a bit, but when you bring up different forms of laboring, of work, aesthetic, authenticity, questions of this, you just can't talk about, or is it, I'm asking you, is it the case that you really can't talk about laboring without questioning the idea of that there's a learning layer to all that anyways? Is that roughly accurate, or am I off base there?
Yeah, and I think you're accurate, and I think this is sort of what makes it so difficult for us to think about our field around work, learning, and social change as being very as isolated or even distinct, because I think there are so many scholars and practitioners who I think are centrally focused on issues of work and learning and social change, and who in fact are situated in a variety of disciplines, sociology, anthropology, women and gender studies, Black studies, critical management studies. So, they may not be in the field of adult learning or adult education. And yet you're right that they, that is a primary focus, I think, of their work, because I don't believe we can so easily separate what we do as work and what we do as learning, And I mean, in that sense, I guess I do really appreciate the work of, the really early scholars in our field who really did talk about the labor that is involved in going in learning, not only in training, but actually in learning, right? And that so but I still feel that we don't, we should appreciate the amorphous boundary of our field, that it's a good thing that there's a lot of potential for the flow of ideas in and out,
And I remember having to do a summary piece or asked to do a summary piece on the field. And I spoke of it not quite exactly like that, but that was definitely the meaning I was after, which is to treat what is in conventional disciplinary terms a weakness, but to treat it as a strength, and that there's all sorts of nuggets of gold that can be found in all sorts of disciplines. And the challenging thing, I know that sometimes, well, it goes back to the kind of thing we're talking about of, is there any real laboring without some form of learning inside it, if you're taking a humanized perspective. But just the question that there's these nuggets of gold, even when authors, like say critical authors from outside the field who aren't particularly interested at all in maybe not even work per se, but definitely not work and learning, but they have some brilliant insight that they wouldn't label as such, but for the study of work and learning in a critical fashion. And as you said, and you know, in terms of your kind of foundational views, taking seriously the kind of idea of the view from the margins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just so tempted to talk about some of your other work and to question, but I think it'll come up in my next question. If it doesn't, I'll just jump in and bring it in. But I'm fascinated to know, because not so. What I've associated with your work is a very critical and delicate treatment. I mean to say conceptually and analytically delicate treatment of transnational economic dynamics in people's lives. But I think that'll maybe come up in a second. So I'm going to go on to my next question, and it is this one. So we've kind of established a bit of a background and a foundational elements of the type of work you do. So building from this background, I want to now ask you about your specific approach, you know, as it exists today, for instance, and then what you would think that makes it distinct, perhaps, within the field. How's it different? What are its unique strengths and contributions, perhaps, along those lines? If you could speak about your kind of, basically your current present day kind of perspective and approach to work, learning, and social change.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I've been kind of thinking about what kinds of, you know, principles I would kind of say maybe guide my approach, you know, as always being present, let's say. And I realized that, you know, one thing that seems to run through the diverse projects, and you know, I do tend to look at different contexts of learning. But one thing that seems to run through it is like this really, you know, this attempt to kind of understand how workplaces are always embedded. And so they can't really be looked at in isolation, but need to be studied in relation to broader social contexts, you know. So certainly global economic relations is one of them. State policies are another one, national histories. And, you know, that macro approach never seems to leave, I guess, any of my projects. But I think another I want to say like principle that guides my approach, has guided my approach, is really a commitment to the methodological value of research, which is based on very detailed ethnographic understandings of people's lived experiences. So I'm really interested how people in these very diverse contexts experience and navigate and challenge, you know, the forms of social exclusion that they experience as part of their daily lives. So I guess, you know, what I would really see as what has been sort of distinct, or my attempt to really approach this field as distinct, has been to really keep in balance this interest in the macro, but also really the interest in, you know, the lived experience of those, you know, macro relations, if you like. And, you know, you had asked me earlier about, you know, the key influences, if you like. And I have a lot of trouble like identifying, like, you know, making a list or making a list of, you know, 3 top influences. But when I think about people, when I think about sort of, I guess, the ideas, I realize that there are some ideas that really have sort of stayed with me for, for a long time, and have really kind of, I would say, almost guided this approach. So just to give you some examples, like, Saskia Sassen has this idea of the hidden infrastructures of globalization. Saskia has this idea that, when you think about globalization, you often think about the very overt actors, the trade relations, the learning, policies, the finance capital, and the multinational firms, and but there are, in some ways, it's sort of this way of thinking about globalization hides in some ways how things are actually being accomplished and by whom. And so I am really interested in this hidden infrastructure of globalization, and that's that's what led me to kind of think about, well, could I, what does it actually mean to speak to people who are not thought of as being, part of globalization or part of the globalization machine, who were the service workers working in these very glamorous, buildings in India. And that's what led me to kind of say, well, can we think about how do they learn to be global actors, given that they're often conceptualized as being outside of globalization? They're seen as very local, just as an example. And also, another example of an idea, I guess, that I find very compelling is Sarah Ahmed's work on, how she talks about sort of the economy of concepts, and I believe learning is one such concept that has an economy. And when she talks about the economy of concepts, I guess what I take from her is this idea that concepts actually circulate and they do certain work. And I believe learning definitely does that. It has an economy. It has an aura of progress and hope and a future. And it potentially hides a dark side where learning can be a source of coercion. So I'm very interested in how learning, serves certain purposes, how it circulates, how it perpetuates certain kinds of inequality, and at the same time can potentially reify or challenge, particular notions.
Well,
Yeah.
there's that normative glaze on learning, or just my phrasing, but of your idea in a way. I just try to make it stick perfectly in there for me. Is very difficult to overcome, and there's not a ton of people who actually bring into the case there are forms of transformation, kind of positive transformations go on in learning, but also just as equally like the reproduction and of basically most of the contradictions and tensions and conflicts, overtly, covertly, and everything in between that happen. And having that fullness of a sense of learning opens it up. And then it almost becomes something that's hard to recognize for mainstream authors or mainstream researchers as learning when you actually entertain all those things. So then you're up against it again in terms of just having to communicate the complexity of ideas there. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the kind of, well, I'll say, and I think I borrowed this from you somewhere. I know I got the reference from you. I don't know, the idea of the lived experience of globality, the idea that what the workers, especially your famed, the phone clone workers. And I want to ask you about this. I can't remember exactly, but I remember in my mind that you had like a really long field experience, like you undertook that research over some strangely absurd amount of time. Maybe speak to that and remind me exactly the amount of time, just so I can kind of let my jaw drop. But no, this kind of this linking between this, like there's not many, in my opinion, work, learning, and social change researchers, definitely not work and learning, workplace learning, conventional researchers that bring in and bring to life these macro dynamics of globalization, global transnational economics, and even in your work, the creation of nationhood vis-a-vis these work situations. Anyways, these aren't really questions, but they're comments, and to situate for a reader or a listener who's not, outside out there in the cyber world, some of the depth of and directions and potentiality of your research. Yeah, so remind me again, what was your field experience for the phone clones?
So it was It was a fairly long field work experience, you're right. But that is the nature of ethnography from afar, you know. It takes time and it's slow going. So, you know, I think it was about 10 years before that I was kind of returning each year to do a little more field work, to meet a few more people, before I kind of felt like I had something to say, you know, and so, you know, could write that book. And I think similarly, about 7 or 8 years for that second project on, you know, people who were not customer service workers, which was what Phone Clones was about, but the people who were around the customer service workers. So these were the cleaners and the housekeepers and the security guards who were, you know, surrounding those global workers. But I have to say that, you know, I do think that there is something to be said for this complex approach to learning, because I think that I think it does allow us to, it is what is useful about the concept, that it allows you to actually trace how change occurs, or how people are in fact engaging in change, you know. And so there's a theorist called Preeti Ramamurthy, and she has this notion of perplexity. And, you know, she says basically, like, it's sort of like almost like this is the way in which people experience power. You know, it's contradictory, it's confusing. You know, people have a desire for material security, but at the same time, a suspicion or a feeling of sort of a loss. You know, when they engage in that desire, they're consumers, and at the same time, they're workers, and, you know, they want both better futures as consumers and as workers. So it's almost like perplexity is sort of a meeting point, right, of all these different trends, if you like. And I guess navigating this kind of perplexity, for the use of that word, is actually learning in the way I think about it. So, you know, I'm sort of I'm drawn to Ramamurthy's idea that is not something that we should shy away from, but in fact that we should it is kind of the heart of our contribution, or the ability of this term, or our focus to do, is to actually engage in that and allow for that kind of opening up. And I think, you know, that term also allows us to kind of see and identify solidarities, you know, to sort of say, well, what are the points of conversion, and what are the points in which we can, we can sort of practice, if you like, or learn around this politics of difference, you know, because as I said, like a lot of my work actually is also interested in the idea of, of difference. I think, you know, I want to sort of really situate everything that all my projects really around the fact that there are systemic ways in which we place people and are placed along the lines of gender, race, and class. And that fundamentally affects, you know, what we can do, but also that is what gives rise to this kind of perplexity. And challenging that, these sort of, I guess, these forms of difference, is the solidarity as practice idea that we can sort of try to engage in through learning, you know.
Yeah, well, that is a what is it? A fertile concept, perplexity, and the experience of perplexity, especially across social differences. Because if it's, as I suspect it would be, take on different forms for different, you know, subordinate and dominant groups in different contexts and situations, it still could be something to trace as a deep learning dynamic that can throw up. Anyways, questions of solidarities that are lying in wait, possibly. Yeah, can I ask you a little bit? It just occurred to me that of all the reading I do in the field of workplace learning and social change, that I'm having trouble, and maybe it's just me and my brain today, I'm not sure. I'm having trouble thinking of leading ethnographers in something that we would recognize as a field of workplace learning. I mean, there's obviously they exist and they do great work, but I can only think of a very, very old reference. Remember that guy Charles Dara, and then maybe some others. But are there a group, like, are you within a group of people who do like methodologically share this? Because it opens up new questions, in my opinion. I don't know if you believe the same thing. I think from what you said, you do. There are other ethnographers, critical ethnographers of work and learning. Am I just losing it here? And there's a ton of them out there, and I'm just blanking.
You know, I think that I often don't think of people. I think there are lots of critical ethnographers of work, and I think that they don't always label what they write about as learning, even though I think really they are, engaged in exactly that kind of work. If you think of a really sort of a well-established ethnographer, I'm thinking about somebody like, Christine Williams. And, Christine Williams wrote about all that work about glass ceilings and glass escalators, and then went on to do these really insightful ethnographies on organizational power and how people navigate, say, diversity training programs and procedures, and engage in certain kinds of working which challenge institutional power. And so I guess, so what, well, I would say, I'm not sure if we can think about that kind of a scholar as a scholar of work and learning as such, but at the same time, I think they really are scholars of work and learning. They're also scholars of work, and they're feminist scholars of falling very clearly in the tradition of feminist political economy. But so much of their work does end up, thinking about, in fact, issues of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Even people like, I mean, if you think about like Himani Banerjee, she has all this work around adult education as essentially what she calls an ideological endeavor, that in fact, like how we are taught, how we learn is not neutral, right? How we name ourselves, how we name others, how we characterize. And so, really, she talks about how the need to engage in learning. The aim is really here to develop counter-organizational knowledge, right? And so I guess I would see her as a scholar of work and learning. Similarly, great ethnographies. I really like the ethnographies done by Eileen Otis, by Milian Kang. Now these are feminist political economists, I would say, who write about I guess the micro politics of learning, of work, really. But I think part of the micro politics of work is in fact learning. So
Yeah.
End up talking about learning.
Yeah, good research is going to be about learning, whether people know it or not, if it's penetrative. And of course there's all these, kind of, I'll say the Jean Lave traditions and social, and in principle that is an ethnographic tradition, although in my experience only not a ton of people continue doing actual full-on ethnographic studies in that tradition. And even Lave, I don't know, it's about I can't say that she takes up, in my opinion anyways, I'd be interested to know yours on this one. I don't think she takes up the questions of work quite the same way that me, or definitely not you, take up in terms of the specificity of work and capitalist political economy, and so on and so forth. I know I don't have you forever, so I'm gonna jump to another question if that's okay. And the question is this one. We kind of went from, early career, current, and then I want to ask you a question that's more looking towards the future. And it's a question I'm trying to ask people in this interview series, which is, are there ideas, traditions, methods, or really anything, research designs that you have lingered in the back of your mind as something you might want to incorporate, plug into your perspective, but then just kind of haven't done it yet, or maybe might not get to it, but you have it in the back of your mind. It's kind of never been written up by you as something you're heading towards, but you have it as something, because I think even people's projection about things that they're interested in, like a scholar in your case, it tells us a lot. You read it backwards and it tells us even a little bit more about what they're doing now, in terms of what they're kind of thinking they might like to pull in later. Is there anything like that that fits that description for you?
I have to say, I have a project idea about once a week. So this is a very large box of things I would love to do and wish one day and hope one day I have time to do, and I think that, it is one of the, I do find it one of the pleasures of working at the place we work, because we have a large cohort of very interesting graduate students to work with. And so there are many interesting projects that even if you don't have time to do yourself, you have some possibility of being involved in some way in terms of the thinking. But I guess, one thing that I've been really wanting to do and hope I can do soon is really to try to understand better the notions of social justice pedagogies that can be integrated into work and learning. I'm really, and especially with this switch in our field, I think, towards mediated learning through technologies, through online learning. I'm really interested in how we can think about work and learning as, pedagogically, in terms of how it could bring about certain kinds of approaches to social justice. So I'm interested in thinking about now how work and learning can in fact be conceptualized, much more as a proactive tool to bring about social justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly have been experiencing, transformations of our relationality in our work, right? Like, I don't know that we'd ever have tried to launch an interview series like this before we kind of gained the some sense of kind of the everydayness of this technology and so on. So yeah, and the emancipatory potential possibly there, and as you and I would too, and also the socially reproductive underbelly of all these things, of course. Okay, I want to ask you a question about if I could pin you down and ask you to say, like 2 emerging issues in the field today that you're keeping an eye on, that you have kind of come to your attention recently. Do you think there's some emerging trends or issues in the field of workplace learning and social change, even broadly conceived in the way we discussed it earlier, that you kind of have caught your attention?
Well, I do think that we will, I'm kind of thinking that we are going to be thinking about learning much more globally. So I think the idea of global, the idea of global or globalization or transnational approaches to learning, I think will are becoming more and more key. And I guess, I believe that we also have now the potential to really think through the role of learning in challenging or in supporting, either racial capitalism, colonization, So I think that we I believe what will be emerging now is a much keener analysis around the role of learning and the potential role to subvert or challenge some of these, some of what we are understanding and learning now around, the ways in which inequality globally kind of manifests.
Absolutely. And I have you in part to thank for thinking about those things myself, reading your work. That's kind of now become part of my radar too. So I'm following you along on that one for sure. Okay, I know you can't stay forever, so I'm going to ask you a final question. I need to ask all, you're part of the what we're calling the Foundational Voices series and the Work Learning Social Change Interviews discussion series. And it's important that senior scholars have a chance to at least say a few words of advice for new scholars. I'm thinking here of PhD graduates and so on and so forth, but also new scholars to the field of work learning and social change, who, as we've kind of talked about here and there throughout the last little while here, they come from all sorts of disciplines, sometimes even like mid-career, or heck, sometimes possibly late career. Anyways, words of advice for people new to the field, especially, I mean, with attention to kind of perhaps doctoral students coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one thing that makes projects really really important in this field is this place that we stand in between theory, practice, and policy. And I think projects that kind of activate these connections are really, really important. I also really support the notion of, trying to understand the world from the margins, because I think it does give you this idea, this way of seeing things that are otherwise hidden or masked, And so I think that's another really important, I think, way forward, for our discipline. And I guess I would also just say that I feel like, there is a potential, just to go back to kind of almost where we started, for, really fulfilling and creative and affirming relations to occur through work and through workplace learning. So in some ways, to keep in mind kind of that, or I want to say that kind of overarching intent or aim, in terms of why we are interested in this issue of learning, to kind of bring about that kind of community or place to be, right? And I also feel that we really want to kind of return to this idea of, or the politics of redistribution that I believe are at the heart of learning. And I think that's another, I guess that's another issue that I feel this sort of field around work learning and social change and the connections we can make have a potential to kind of return us to that, or that, I want to say, like, that heart, I guess, of the whole educational mission, which I believe is around redistribution.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, in the middle of all that, it's both a socially important set of advices you just gave that I thought were beautifully put, but also kind of a hopeful, kind of like not losing an imagination for an institution, a world a work world that can actually be inhabitable in a humane way, right? It sounds revolutionary, but it's really important. It was very nicely said. Okay, Kiran, I just want to thank you. I'm going to just bring us to a close. I want to thank you for taking the time to contribute to the series. I say this near the end of these interviews regularly, that it's really taking seriously how people learn. It's important. People will have read your work a lot, students, scholars out there, but there is something different when they see you speak to it directly, and they put a face to a name. Anyways, so thank you very much for spending some time with me this afternoon, and I guess I'll just say goodbye.
Thank you, Peter. Real pleasure to do this.